I grew up in a staunchly Zionist, modern Orthodox Jewish community here in the US. I'm also the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, and I'd like to examine and talk through the mechanics of how Holocaust trauma is passed down to younger Jewish generations in order to manufacture buy-in and consent to the culture and agenda of Israeli militarism. This is not a complete PhD thesis. This is just some pondering. There are two phenomena that I would like to focus on right now. The first is the very limited, the very myopic nature of Holocaust education in my community. The second is the phenomenon of what we call heritage trips to Poland that often culminate in a few days, ending the trip with a few days in Israel. So firstly, Holocaust education. I think intuitively now as an adult, I think, oh, I'm from a lineage of genocide survivors. If we're going to create curricula of genocide education, presumably you would zoom out and not just teach about the experience of your own genocide, but you would also explore the other instances of ethnic genocide across history and across the globe. My formal education placed a heavy emphasis on the Nazi Holocaust. We studied it every year. We did not study genocide globally. I mean, other than maybe a few days on Rwanda in high school, I had no formal education on ethnic cleansing across the globe. I went to a good school, right, that sends kids off to every Ivy League school. And yet I was, in my late teen years, walking around thinking that the word Holocaust definitionally applied to Jews. I was not taught about the Khmer Rouge's genocide of millions of Cambodians. I was not taught about the Ottoman genocide of Armenians. I was not taught about King Leopold's the nearly 10 million people exploited and murdered in the Congo by Belgian King Leopold. And, we learned a little bit about the Trail of Tears, but we did not learn about the genocide of indigenous Americans. It wasn't named genocide. The Nazi Holocaust was presented to me as this unique phenomenon, utterly unparalleled and unmatched and unlike anything else across the globe and across history. And even regarding the Nazi Holocaust, we only ever talked about the 6 million Jews who were murdered. The Nazis killed almost 5 million other people, gays, Roma, disabled, other Polish political prisoners. We didn't recite their names at our vigils on Holocaust Memorial Day. Our understanding of the Holocaust is extremely self-centered. It was mortifying to discover in my late teens, early 20s, how shallow Never Again was, when I didn't even know that Holocausts had been happening and continue to happen to other communities. Theodor Herzl, the founder, the father of modern Zionism, wrote, I'm paraphrasing, but he wrote, no group in history has suffered the way the Jewish people have suffered. This is simply not true. The Jewish attachment to our own main character status as Hitler's victims completely misses the plot and completely misses the deeper lessons of this human catastrophe. Again, I'm not saying this to vilify my community, but our staggering lack of awareness and curiosity about human suffering outside of our own experience is, to me, it's like ethnic narcissism. And I don't say narcissism as an insult. I say it as a totally non-clinical cultural diagnosis and an invitation to investigate something that is broken. The second thing I want to talk about are the heritage trips to Poland. These are run and organized by various organizations. My high school offered a heritage trip to its high school seniors for many years, where they take you to Poland for 5 days and then you go to Israel for a few days. I didn't go when I was a senior in high school. I spent a year after high school at an Orthodox women's seminary in Jerusalem for the year, and I went on their heritage trip to Poland. These heritage trips usually consist of a cross-country tour of concentration camps, mass graves, and buildings that used to be homes to thriving Jewish life. It's a little bit like Birthright meets the Hajj, right? It's this religious pilgrimage to a site of Jewish ethnic destruction in service of cultivating a political commitment to a Jewish ethno-state in Israel. These heritage trips are a modern Jewish, almost coming-of-age rite, this ceremonial practice of re-traumatizing Jews of all ages by taking them to the actual room where it happens. Shout out Lin-Manuel. It's a pilgrimage to a literal gas chamber, to standing inside the crematoria and by mass graves as a way to sanctify and pass down what is now like the most sacred Jewish legacy, not our culture, but our suffering. These trips are considered a way to honor Jewish victims and connect with Jewish ancestry and strengthen Jewish solidarity. And they can achieve these goals, but in my experience, the trip to Poland was the single most effective mechanism for passing down and keeping Holocaust trauma alive in me. It like ignites this like pilot light inside of you of this constant awareness and this constant fear that this shit can happen again at any time. These trips are reliable generators of very real grief and tears, but they do not offer anything in the way of healing, right? There aren't debriefing, or in my experience, there weren't, therapeutic debriefing sessions to grapple with the emotional legacy of the Holocaust and of survivors. There's no space to be curious about survivor behavioral patterns and family dynamics. And I had plenty of questions. How is it that my grandfather, a survivor, and his brother, how did they become estranged after an experience like that? How come there's so much screaming in my house? How come every conversation with my grandfather follows almost an identical script? Why is he so able to talk about the horrifying conditions he experienced, but he can't tell me anything about his sister who was murdered, before the war? And what's our responsibility now? Should we try to help these survivors move through their trauma, or should we just allow them and encourage them to stew in their horror stories? Is my grandfather, will he ever see himself as anything more than a survivor? And how do I mourn the fact that I might never see any other side of him? I also want to say that the state of Israel runs these trips for its high school students. So it drowns its high school students in imagery of heinous brutality against European Jewry as a way to manufacture buy-in for its militarism. I'd like to finish with just a couple of minutes reading a few diary entries from the trip that I took when I was 19 to Poland. Friday, October 16, 2009. On Wednesday, we all went on a solemn march into a forest where we stood around a mass grave. We all read testimony of survivors who were in the forest while we're spread out amongst the trees. Being in the frigid forest with the snow coming down hard was absolutely terrifying, even while it was daylight hours. I started shaking when I began to imagine being driven there in the middle of a freezing cold night, being told to strip off all my clothing and stand in a pit on top of corpses, shaking, waiting for my death to be shot. I can't fathom it. October 17th. Yesterday was a long, dreadful, painful, emotionally abusive day. We spent 4 hours in Majdanek, a concentration camp. I can't explain how I felt. There just aren't words. Honestly, in my life, I have never sobbed so intensely and felt so terrified. I realized that the torturous plight of the Jews was a slow process. I could finally visualize what happened, but I couldn't fathom how my Saba, my grandfather, physically withstood everything. I missed him so much. All I wanted to do was sit with him in his little apartment in Queens. I started to be sickened by Poland, the language and seeing it written all over, I hated that I was in Poland and not in Israel. I've just become terrified because this could happen again. Evil has merely taken on a new form. Islamic terrorism/jihad. Uh-oh! That's that sweet, sweet post-9/11 propaganda. I tried not to, but I couldn't help having visions of my whole family being taken and shot by Taliban soldiers, and the world being too worried about its own safety to care about Jews. I just know that Jews will never be safe, but the most meaningful way to live is in Israel. I will live in Israel. One more little paragraph for a little peek into the Zionist anti-Arab racism and propaganda that I was fully drunk on. We drove to Treblinka death camp. It was blizzarding and frozen. It's sickening that a place was constructed by its own victims with the sole purpose of exterminating human beings. What kind of sick, mentally corrupted monster comes up with that? How does the idea even enter one's mind? Just because I despise terrorists doesn't mean I'm going to make Arabs/Muslims build a camp and gas themselves to death. The foreshadowing. It is utterly humiliating to share this publicly, but I think essential. I talk a lot about the Jewish emotional legacy of the Holocaust as being stuck communally in a state of fight or flight, really just fight. And that when you're in that kind of emotional state, absorbing that kind of racism and hatred of another group, ironically, right, because you're the victim, your ancestors are the victim of that, ironically it becomes easy and almost intuitive to reject and fear other groups of people. I just don't see a way forward without ruthless self-critique and without honesty about ugliness that I have digested, that I'm trying to unlearn.